everybody in the world by?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we begin with our next segment, I do want to remind you yet again to avail yourselves to the features that you can find on YouTube, whether it be through Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers. You guys have been great all week in that department. We want to continue this narrative as we continue our shows next week. Everything is greatly appreciated by both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole, so do please consider this and make yourselves available to that. Without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of today's show, and it should be a good one. For the first time on the show, we're going to be talking some stardom-sit-em situations. Now, stardom-sit-em is always very fun to get into. You always kind of pinpoint the matchups you want to target with your certain players. And the excitement surrounding different matchups early on in the season, when certain teams have easier schedules, it becomes kind of this chess match where you're trying to decipher how to kickstart your fantasy football season on the right foot. And so, all these guys that I've compiled, these are kind of my own opinion, really, of how to find those matchups where you either are eager to start a certain guy or you're kind of apprehensive about and you wish to sit him. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Our first stardom sit-em of the week is a start, and this guy is going to be back with a vengeance against a defense who I really do not like the profile of for the season. That is Joe Burrow. A lot of people might be skeptical about me wanting to start Joe Burrow for many different reasons. One, because of the wrist injury. We don't necessarily know how he's going to look, and on his throwing hand, it's a little bit complicated to come back from. But I don't necessarily think he'll have to do too much in this game against a Pats defense that lost 15.5 sack production from Matthew Judon, and also have the issue of Christian Barmore, one of their leading defensive tackles, not going to be starting early on in the season due to blood clot issues. So this defense certainly looks very barren of playmakers, and I'm not really excited about what an experienced quarterback will do to this Patriots defense to kick off the year. But the wrist injury, if it's giving you pause, just know that there's no defense that I think of more worse than the New England Patriots. I think this will be a much simpler game than people expect for Joe Burrow to get back on track to start off his season. But then there's also the situation that people might be thinking about with Jamar Chase and his contract holdout and the tension there. Obviously, T. Higgins, like we said during the week, franchise tagged, tied down for at least one more year. And now all attention turns to Jamar Chase, even though there's 2 years left in his contract, still holding out. And I think this is more because of the way he has seen the wide receiver market transpire this offseason that he is doing this. I don't necessarily think this is a internal issue within the Cincinnati Bengals organization. That being said, teams like the Bengals and the Cowboys, as we saw with the length of how long it took for CeeDee Lamb to tie down his extension, they have been kind of timid in terms of setting the tone for the wide receiver market this offseason, because everyone expected those big guys to immediately get their contracts. But that's not necessarily how it works, though. I think that the timidity kind of played into the hands of the receivers, and now it's kind of coming full circle as we see with Jamar Chase. That being said, I still have no concerns. And again, it's because of the Patriots defense. No matter who is on the field at receiver for the Bengals come this game, I think Joe Burrow will have a lot of success. And in terms of the overall fantasy perspective of this game, I don't necessarily think Joe Burrow will put up the biggest numbers. I don't think he's going to be throwing for 300, 350 or anything like that. I think he's going to be more around the 270 range. But that will be okay because I think he'll have a lot of touchdowns against this defense. I think that Joe Burrow, what I love about him is he picks apart different defenses. He's not always looking for the big shot. He's not always looking for the deep ball. He's looking to pick apart defenses at his will and set the tempo for his offense. So I think Joe Burrow is an immediate start right away. Wrist injury be damned. Now the sit. This is a little bit before nobody knew who the Pittsburgh starter was going to be as they open up their season against the Atlanta Falcons. As Tap to Learn says, Mike Gesicki could get some targets. I did not actually know Mike Gesicki was on the Bengals, but he is an interesting person. Actually, he's on the Patriots, rather. I forgot about that. I think that Mike Gesicki getting targets in this Patriots offense could be a good thing, but still, I think that the overall profile of the Patriots offense right now does not look promising. It's telling that Gerard Mayo does not want to put Drake May out there right now because of that offensive situation. I'm not saying that this game will be a pretty game. I think it's going to be an ugly game for both teams. But, as you point out, Gesicki is an interesting guy. I don't think he's the best of tight ends right now. I think the tight end market is just becoming so expansive in how we interpret it. But he is someone who's very interesting. That being said, outside of him, who are the Patriots really going to rely upon? Kendrick Bourne, a rookie in Javon Baker? I'm not necessarily certain. So while it's a good point that Mike Gesicki profiled as someone who can get a lot of volume in this offense, I don't think that it's going to be enough for the Patriots. But that's a fantastic comment. I completely had forgotten about Mike Gesicki in this team. But let's get back to the Stidham situation in Pittsburgh. This was kind of before we knew who the Pittsburgh starter was, but it is Russell Wilson. And against Atlanta, it's going to be an interesting game, like we talked about in the betting preview segment. I think that, Atlanta's defense doesn't necessarily profile as one of the most threatening. It's just that the Pittsburgh offense is equally unthreatening. I think that, if Russell can develop that rapport with George Pickens, that could be a special partnership because I really like George Pickens. He's a guy who we haven't necessarily talked about as we talked about wide receivers, and he profiles as someone who should get the lion's share of targets in Pittsburgh. But I think where the fault stems from the play calling. Then you definitely have to change the play calling for a guy like Russell Wilson because some of his best traits have diminished over the years and have kind of reduced what he can do in certain offensive schemes. And so it's going to be all about finding what makes Russ comfortable in the system because I don't necessarily think he's going to be the starter a year from now for Pittsburgh. This is just kind of like the tail end of his career, trying to prove that he might still be able to play for someone, maybe not as a starter, but as a competent backup. That's what I think of Russell Wilson right now. And against Atlanta, like I said, Atlanta, you can kind of do a little more against them. I don't necessarily think their defense is as prolific as some others. They did add Matthew Judon. I like that. I love Jesse Bates in their secondary. I love A.J. Terrell. He's a do-it-all linebacker, can line up anywhere for them. That being said, as Tap to Learn says, this is a little bit of advice for him. Will Levis or Russell Wilson? Who to start? That is an interesting one. I don't have who the Titans play this week, but I think that they do play the Bears, actually. So the Bears and Falcons, let's compare those defenses to kind of better understand the matchups for these two quarterbacks. The Bears defense, I am also kind of putting them in that same terrain as the Atlanta Falcons defense. They're very similar. They have a lot of interesting players both at the linebacker position and in the secondary. But that being said, Will Levis just excites me more as someone who is now going to understand the role he has in this Titans offense. I don't think, he has that much pressure on his shoulders. I think the pressures are more on his receiving core. Guys like Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins deliver for him. And he has a backfield that I really like. Maybe not Tony Pollard, we'll talk about him later, but Tyjae Spears, I like him and the rapport they built last year. And on the other hand, Russell kind of in this weird Pittsburgh situation where he knows he might be on a short leash if he doesn't start off the season well because of Justin Fields lurking behind him on the bench. And an offense that, while it does have exciting players, don't necessarily project to be the best. And they're playing a Falcons team that has so much hype around them. I would start Will Levis. And I know it's a bit of a risk because Will Levis has less experience than Wilson. But right now, Levis' situation and the matchup where you're against a Bears defense that, while I like their youth, I like Jalen Johnson, their secondary, I don't think that highly of right now. So, to answer your question, I would kind of comfortably say that Will Levis is the smarter pick. And I feel kind of weird saying that. But I think at this current moment, Will Levis should be your guy. Back to this whole narrative about Russell Wilson. If it does end up, playing, how does this raise his value as a fantasy player? To the point where maybe we will be saying, hey, we can feel comfortable starting Wilson in more weeks, more often than not. But at this current juncture, I'm not that confident in, starting him out or this early in the season. I want to wait and see for this offense. Let's get to some running backs, shall we? And the stardom pick for me this week is kind of an interesting one because of this situation in Minnesota. But I really like Aaron Jones against the Giants. This is going to be a classic smash mouth game, I believe. We talked about Minnesota a little bit throughout the week, what with their situation, the J.J. McCarthy injury, Sam Darnold, now the starter full-time for them, at least for the season. We talked about all the weapons they had in Jay Jettis. We talked about Addison as well. We talked about when T.J. Hawkinson will project to return a little bit, and we'll talk about it later on next week. But right now, I think this game will be all about winning ugly for either of these teams. Both of these teams project to not get as many wins this year, but they'll take wins however they come. And Aaron Jones kind of defines that ugliness. He's not someone who you would think of as, in terms of explosiveness, yards after contact, really getting to the end zone anymore. But he is someone who's a physically tough guy who can pick up yards in bunches. And that's what he's gonna have to do in this game. Now we look at the Giants' defense, and it looks a lot more daunting this year. And you think that maybe O'Connell and this offense will take more advantage of the pass game because that's where they're the weakest. I don't necessarily like the secondary for the Giants as much as their front seven. You have guys like Brian Burns, who you just brought in. You have guys like Thibodeau up front getting better and better. Continues to improve with Dexter Lawrence as kind of the nose tackle in this system. But the reason why I think Aaron Jones is going to be this is I think that Kevin O'Connell might want to ease Sam Darnold into the idea of him passing a little bit more. And I think the overarching sentiment of this game is going to be the volume of touches each of the big players on this team are going to get. Because whoever has more volume within their big players will win. And right now the Giants, they're not necessarily going to have that much drives, I think, in this game. I think they're going to rely on their defense. As another question from Tap to Learn says, Aaron Jones or Kyron Williams, who is questionable, I believe that means, start in the Rams season opener? That is another fascinating question. I still will stick with Jones. I actually do not like Kyron Williams as a fantasy running back for the whole season. I think that last year was kind of an aberration because that was kind of the year where all these Rams rookies produced much more. As he says, the Rams will play the Lions at Ford Field. And again, that's another interesting game where you have two playoff contenders. But the reason why I'm still taking Aaron Jones is because both the Vikings and the Giants profile as teams that want to win ugly, whereas the Rams and the Lions have much more diversified attacks. They're much more experimental on the offensive side of the football. And overall, they have much more weapons to distribute the ball to than teams like the Vikings or the Giants, even though the Vikings have Justin Jefferson. Let's get back to the whole Aaron Jones thing. Because of the fact, like I said, he's not as appealing in terms of explosiveness and, immediacy in terms of touchdown scoring as other quarterbacks out there. But he will get a lot of touchdowns in this game because of the physicality both of these teams will try to drag the other team into. And so that's why right now Aaron Jones feels more comfortable for me as a fantasy football kind of connoisseur trying to sort out all these questions. Because, like I said, the Rams and Lions have more verbiage in their offensive setups to attack you with. Let's get into the player who I will sit. And this guy might not even be on a lot of your rosters. He might not even be in the discussion for you at the running back position throughout the entirety of the season, even if you are thinking him as a flex or streaming option. That is Ezekiel Elliott, Cowboy against the Browns. And it's just kind of simple. I don't like Zeke overall coming back into this Cowboys offense, and especially against one of, if not the best defenses in the league. I think that this is going to be one of those games where, again, both of these teams have enough talent, but also the talent is dispersed around the team to where it's going to be a game where it's going to be interesting. Where, as we get another comment from Jake Tokarczyk, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Saquon Barkley, I believe he is saying, or Jonathan Taylor. Ooh, that's another interesting matchup. Ooh, I like that one a lot. I think that Saquon, I'm not sure who he's playing, but I'm not sure who Jonathan Taylor is playing as. So I'm going to kind of go off the cuff here. I think that when I just look at these two names and how they fit into their team's offenses, I say Jonathan Taylor. Mainly because I think he's going to be relied upon more in that Colts offense as Anthony Richardson tries and cements himself as a competent NFL quarterback. That being said, Saquon in that Philadelphia Eagles offense really intrigues me. As Tap to Learn says that Philly is playing Green Bay. Okay, so that makes it a little bit more interesting. The Green Bay Packers defense here. I don't necessarily like them as much either. I like their secondary a little bit, but not overall. So this becomes an even tougher question. But at face value, as we try and get, information about the Colts here, I think that Jonathan Taylor, to me, is more of a long-term guy. As Tap to Learn again, fantastic commenter. Keep it up because I might need some updates. Indy plays Houston. That's right. The divisional start-off is going to be an interesting game. A lot of storylines there. Houston's defense. As Cam, like I said, if you have any trade advice as well. Hey man, I'm new here. I just wanted to leave an opinion on a trade that's finalized. If you had the time, of course, hit me. But we are still sticking with the first question, so I'll give you some time to drop your trade analysis in the comments. Let's get back to Jake's comment here. Barkley or Jonathan Taylor, now that we know the matchups. Jonathan Taylor, like I said, feels to me more of a long-term kind of running back as the season goes on, because I think that he will grow into the season as the Colts grow as a team. If I were to take this at face value for just week one, maybe I would kind of favor Barkley here because, like I said, Green Bay's defense, I only like the secondary, and I think that the intriguing nature that Saquon Barkley brings to the Philadelphia Eagles offense adds a little bit of diversity to it. I think that it alleviates a lot of the pressure on Jalen Hurts as a runner, and it also profiles Saquon Barkley as someone who might be seen as someone who's going to get a lot of explosive plays in this offense. So, that being said, if we're just going off week one, start Saquon. If we're going long term, I think Jonathan Taylor is going to give you more value week in, week out. But just based off the matchup that I see here for week 1, that's who I'm going to say for week 1. We're still waiting on Cam. So that gives me a little bit more time to talk about a guy who you might not want me to talk about in Zeke Elliott. Like I said, he's not a popular guy in fantasy terms. He might not even be on your radar. But like I said, if you were considering rostering him, if you do have him on your roster, I think that you definitely don't want to because of that Browns defense. Let's go into the wide receiver market a little bit. Let's start off with a start. This is a surprise. This might be a surprising one for people, but I definitely like it a lot. How about Davante Adams against the Los Angeles Chargers? Hear me out here. This is a interesting divisional game because this is the start of the Jim Harbaugh era in LA. This is also kind of the start of the Antonio Pierce era in Las Vegas. Now, both of these coaches have said that their philosophies are to ground and pound the football. They are going to be very physical, gritty teams all season long. But the caveat here is that in whatever ways they're going to pass the football, Davante Adams is the only weapon that scares me in this matchup. And because of that, even though I don't think passing will be high, I don't think either quarterback will be passing that often, Davante Adams, and whatever targets he does get, will make the most of them. The Chargers defense has a lot of good depth to it. They still have Joey Bosa. They still have Khalil Mack. They have Derwin James as a safety. Very good free safety. Lines up everywhere, can even blitz as well. But the reason why Davante Adams is so integral to this game is because he is the X factor on both sides of the football in terms of actually understanding the intricacies of opposing defenses and thus creating mismatches for whenever the Raiders do want to throw the football. Because eventually, I do feel like they'll be dragged into this game and one of them will have to find a way to get going in the pass game. So, I don't think it will be pretty, but Davante Adams could be a sneaky good week 1 start for you. And then, to sit, this one is still very simple. DeAndre Hopkins against the Bears. I don't like how this whole setup for him looks. And he's also coming off a knee injury. Make of that what you will. But he's also in his age 32 season. We'll talk about this a little later in the show. Once you get to that threshold as a wide receiver, there's not much hope. As much as I love what he brings to this Titans offense where they're trying to break in Will Levis, I don't think that this will be the game for him. That being said, he could be interesting throughout the season. There could be matchups that you like with him. But for now, coming off that knee injury, age being a concern, I think you sit him. I think that this overarching sentiment for all these players who have laid out, whether starting or sitting, is that it's all about matchups in week 1. I think week 1 is where you really start to hone in on trying to figure out who on your roster will best fit for A, to start off the season, or B, maybe be a late bloomer and grow into the season, because that's the importance here. You want to set a good tone to start off the season, but you also might want to start determining different factors that might affect your team as well. So those guys that I've just talked about, be attuned to them in their week 1 starts. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we'll be looking at some running back busts. The running back market, obviously, very versatile as we talked about throughout the week. And these are just guys who I don't necessarily see, whether it be just a circumstance of their situation or other reasons, I don't necessarily think you should be looking at. But that will come right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it?